about Iran, which is collecting tolls to allow shipments to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, reports claim that payments are being made in Chinese yuan and also require a passcode and has to clear some checks. According to Bloomberg, this is the modus operandi. To successfully move a shipment, it must be destined for friendly or non-combatant nations. This toll, largely collected in Chinese currency, goes into the hands of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, indicating that the IRGC exerts control over the Strait of Hormuz. Ship operators are required.
Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that a tiny stretch of water most people have never heard of is suddenly controlling the price of fuel, food, and survival itself across the planet. Now imagine one country quietly tightening its grip on that lifeline, expecting the world to panic and comply, but instead triggering something far more dangerous. What really happened behind the scenes? Who miscalculated? And why does it feel like this story is just getting started?
The UK brought together more than 40 countries for talks on ways to open the Strait of Hormuz. The US did not take part. Shipping through the strait has slowed to a trickle after weeks of Iranian attacks on commercial vessels. At least 23 incidents have been reported since late February, when the US and Israel started the war by attacking Iran. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage between Iran and Oman that connects the Persian Gulf to global shipping lanes. Normally, about 20...
The world runs on invisible systems that most people never think about until something breaks. And one of the most critical of those systems is a narrow stretch of water that most people could not point to on a map without help. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping lane, it is the artery through which a massive portion of the world's energy supply flows. And when that artery gets squeezed, the entire global economy starts to feel lightheaded in a way that suddenly makes everyone very interested in geography. So, when tensions between the United States and Iran escalated into something far more aggressive than the usual diplomatic back and forth, the stakes were never going to stay politely contained, multiplying. Iran, through its military arm, made a bold move to assert control over the Strait of Hormuz, effectively turning one of the most important economic choke points in the world into a geopolitical pressure valve. At first glance, this looks almost brilliant because if you can influence the flow of oil, you can influence the behavior of nations that depend on that oil, and suddenly, you are no longer just reacting to pressure but applying it. However, there is always a catch in geopolitics, and the catch is usually hidden inside one simple question that people often forget to ask. What happens when everyone else refuses to play along?
Asia is bearing the brunt of the global oil supply shock because it depends heavily on the Middle East. Around 60% of its oil comes from the region. So what's the alternative? Here's what Donald Trump is proposing.
I have a suggestion. Number one, buy oil from the United States of America. We have plenty. We have so much.
But switching isn't that simple. Asian refiners have limited options to diversify for several reasons. First, the type of crude.
To understand why this move was so dramatic, it helps to step back and consider just how vital this narrow passage really is. Every day, millions of barrels of oil pass through this corridor, moving from the oil-rich Gulf region to markets in Asia, Europe, and beyond. Countries like China, India, and Japan depend heavily on this flow. And even countries that are not directly importing from the region still feel the effects because global energy markets do not operate in isolation. When the flow slows down or stops, prices do not politely adjust. They jump, they spike, and they drag inflation along with them like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. Suddenly, something happening in a distant waterway starts showing up in fuel prices, food costs, and economic anxiety thousands of miles away. So when contained, and it would not just affect one country, it would affect everyone. This is where the idea of the trap becomes important, because the strategy seemed to rely on a very specific chain reaction. The expectation was that disrupting global oil flow would create economic pain, that economic pain would create political pressure, and that political pressure would force the United States to reconsider its approach. It sounds logical on paper, and on paper, a lot of things sound like excellent ideas right up until reality gets involved. However, this is where things start to take a turn that feels almost ironic, because the assumption that economic disruption automatically translates into political leverage does not always hold up under pressure. In fact, when critical global systems are threatened, countries do not always panic in isolation. They often coordinate. Instead of quietly turning against the United States, many nations began aligning around a shared objective, which was restoring stability to a system they all depend on. This raises a question that feels both simple and uncomfortable. Did Iran underestimate how quickly a global problem can turn into a global response? The United States, for its part, did not treat the situation as a delicate negotiation that required careful balancing. It framed it as a direct threat to global commerce and energy security, which is a very effective way of turning a regional conflict into an international cause. This is where the so-called brutal move enters, could move through the Strait of Hormuz without interference, and achieving that objective meant neutralizing any capability that could enforce the blockade. This included targeting naval threats, disrupting surveillance systems, and applying enough pressure to make sustained control of the waterway extremely difficult. The message was not wrapped in diplomatic language. It was delivered through action. And the message was that no single actor would be allowed to dictate the terms of global trade in such a critical location.
Middle Eastern oil are different, and many Asian refineries are built specifically to process Middle Eastern grades. Retooling them could cost billions of dollars. Second, distance and logistics. Oil from the Middle East can reach Asia in about 25 days via the Strait of Hormuz, according to shipping industry estimates. In contrast, shipments from the U.S. Gulf Coast that cross the Atlantic, sail around southern Africa and into the Indian Ocean can take up to 2 months, adding to costs. Third, long-term contracts. Many countries are locked into multi-year deals.
What makes this response particularly striking is the level of escalation it represents, because it shifts the narrative entirely. Instead of being seen as a bilateral dispute between two countries, the situation was reframed as a threat to the global system itself. Once that framing takes hold, everything changes. Other countries are no longer bystanders, they are stakeholders. They have both the incentive and the justification to get involved, whether through diplomatic support, economic measures, or even military cooperation. At this point, the original strategy begins to reveal its unintended consequences. Instead of cornering the United States, the move to control the Strait of Hormuz gave it a strategic advantage in terms of narrative. By positioning itself as the defender of global trade, it was able to rally support and justify actions that might otherwise have been questioned. It is a classic case of a move that looks powerful in isolation, but becomes problematic when it triggers a stronger, driven by both real disruption and the fear of what might happen next. This amplifies the sense of crisis and increases the urgency for action, which in turn accelerates decision-making in ways that are not always predictable. However, the pressure created by rising prices does not only affect those on the receiving end. It also creates complications for the side applying the pressure. Reduced shipping activity, increased military risk, and the possibility of broader economic consequences all begin to chip away at the intended benefits. What started as a tool for leverage begins to look more like a double-edged sword, and suddenly the situation is not just about applying pressure, but managing fallout. As events continued to unfold, it became increasingly clear that the attempt to control the Strait of Hormuz was not producing the intended isolation of the United States. Instead, it was drawing in a wider range of actors who all had a shared interest in keeping the waterway open. This collective interest translated into coordinated efforts, and those efforts began to shift the balance of power in a way that made the original strategy harder to sustain. One of the most revealing aspects of this entire episode is how quickly things shifted from a unilateral action to a multilateral response. It is almost as if the move pressed a button that activated a broader system, and once that system was in motion, it was not easy to stop. This highlights a fundamental reality of the modern world, which is that actions taken in critical systems rarely stay contained. They ripple outward, triggering responses that can be larger and more complex than anyone initially anticipates. The idea of the trap backfiring captures this perfectly, because it reflects the gap between intention and outcome. The strategy was designed to constrain an opponent, but it ended up creating new opportunities for that opponent to act with greater justification and support. It is the kind of outcome that looks obvious in hindsight, but was likely far less clear when the initial decision reinforces its role in maintaining access to global trade routes. But it also underscores the risks of escalation and the costs that come with it. For Iran, the experience offers a complicated lesson about the importance of anticipating not just immediate reactions, but broader, coordinated responses that can reshape the situation entirely. Ultimately, this entire episode raises deeper questions about how power works in a world that is more interconnected than ever. Is it possible to use control over critical systems without provoking a response that diminishes that control? How do countries navigate the fine line between asserting influence and triggering escalation? And perhaps most importantly, what lessons will be taken from this moment as future strategies are developed? Because if there is one thing this situation makes abundantly clear, it is that in a world like this, no move exists in isolation. Every action sets off a chain reaction, and sometimes that reaction is bigger, faster, and far more dramatic than anyone expected. Economies do not simply adjust calmly and rationally. They panic, they react, and they look for the fastest possible way to restore stability. So instead of quietly pressuring the United States behind closed doors, countries began to align, coordinate, and prepare to act, because the alternative was simply too costly to tolerate. Now here is where the storytelling gets interesting, because the move that was supposed to create leverage started to create something else entirely: urgency. And urgency is dangerous because it compresses decision-making timelines and makes bold actions far more likely. The United States did not respond like a nation that felt trapped. It responded like a nation that had just been handed a very clear justification to act decisively and, if necessary, aggressively. This is the part where people start using words like brutal. And while that might sound dramatic, it is not entirely inaccurate. The response was not about subtlety or symbolic gestures. It was about capability, speed, and dominance in a very specific domain. If the Strait of Hormuz was going to be used as a chokehold, then the response was to break that chokehold in a way that made it very difficult to reapply. You can almost picture the strategic conversation because it probably went something like this. If you allow this precedent to stand, what stops it from happening again? What stops any actor from deciding that they can control a global choke point whenever they feel like it? And once you start asking those questions, the logic becomes very clear, even if the execution is anything but gentle. So the United States leaned in, not out. And that is where the irony starts to hit, because the original trap relied on the idea that pressure would force restraint. Instead, the pressure triggered escalation. Instead of backing down, the response became more assertive, more coordinated, and frankly, more forceful than what might have happened under normal circumstances. It is almost as if the strategy accidentally flipped a switch that said, now you have to deal with this decisively. But here is the part that really makes you pause and think, because it raises a deeper question about strategy in general. Is it enough to have leverage? Or do you also need to understand how that leverage will be perceived? Because leverage that feels like coercion often invites resistance, and resistance, when backed by enough power, can turn into something much harder to manage. As ships slowly began to test the waters again, under protection and with heightened security, the message became clearer with each passing day. The Strait of Hormuz was not going to remain closed indefinitely, and any attempt to keep it that way would be met with sustained effort to reopen it. This was not a one-off reaction. It was the beginning of a broader commitment to ensuring that the flow of energy could not be easily disrupted. And here is where the sarcasm practically writes itself, because the idea of controlling a global choke point sounds incredibly powerful right up until the moment the rest of the world decides that they are not okay with it. At that point, it stops being a clever strategy and starts being a very expensive problem. You also have to consider the long-term implications, because this is not just about what happens in the moment. It is about what this teaches everyone involved. For the United States, it reinforces the importance of maintaining the ability to project power in critical regions. For other countries, it highlights the risks of overdependence on a single route or resource. And for Iran, it presents a very complicated lesson about the difference between creating pressure and triggering a response that spirals beyond your control. So when people say the trap backfired, they are not just talking about the immediate tactical outcome. They are not neat linear narratives where one move leads directly to a predictable result. They are complex, dynamic interactions where each decision reshapes the landscape in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate. What seems like a bold advantage in one moment can become a liability in the next, depending on how others respond. So as you watch this situation continue to develop, the real question is not just what happens next, but what everyone learns from it. Will strategies become more cautious or more aggressive? Will countries invest more in alternatives to vulnerable choke points or double down on securing them? And perhaps most intriguingly, will the next attempt to use a critical global system as leverage take into account the lessons from this one? Or will history, as it often does, find a way to repeat itself with a slightly different script? Because if there is one thing this entire episode has made clear, it is that in a world this interconnected, no move exists in isolation, and every action has a reaction that is often bigger, louder, and far more complicated than